Fantasy dialogue is a double-edged sword. Get it right and your characters come alive. Get it wrong and they sound like medieval LARPing enthusiasts reading bad poetry. In this video, I will be reviewing 6 submissions from members of the Tale Tinkerers Guild. And since these dialogue scenes don't provide all the context a reader would have had by this point, the focus will be on what these extracted scenes convey on their own. And here's the first submission by Armored Hero 11. Eleonora's voice rose gently above the noise of the crowd. How is Valen? Adrian turned, catching her mother's worried gaze, and beside her, Winfrey's as well. He'll manage, Adrian assured them. No broken bones, but his shoulder's badly bruised. There could be a fracture, I couldn't be certain, but I gave him a potion just in case, along with a salve for the pain. It should hold him through the tournament, provided he doesn't take another serious blow. Eleonora exhaled in relief, though worry still lingered in her soft grey eyes. A smart girl, Sadeas said gruffly, nodding approvingly. Then his tone shifted, adopting a familiar fatherly weight. Now if only you put half as much dedication into choosing a proper match instead of writing poetry and playing love songs to every passing maiden. Adrian groaned, her grey and green eyes rolling. Oh, here we go again. Sadeas' brow arched. I'm simply saying, daughter, that a Surfrush should spend less time chasing the fleeting whims of romance and more time considering who will stand beside them in life. Adrian lifted her chin defiantly, her ears twitching with amusement. I am searching for that one person, father, and if I must woo with charm, poetry, and song until I find her, then so be it, she grinned impishly. This is a solid piece of dialogue if you ask me. Right away we can feel the personalities of these characters. Adrian is playful, confident, and unbothered by her father's concerns, while Sadeas comes across as a traditionalist who wants what's best for his daughter, even if they don't see eye to eye. What I really like about this exchange is that it doesn't just tell us who they are, it shows us through how they speak and react to each other. The dynamic feels lived in, like this is a conversation they've had many times before. That's a sign of strong character voice. But if I were polishing this scene myself, there are a couple of things I might adjust to make the dialogue even stronger. First, Thaddeus' lines feel a little too structured to me. He's a noble father figure, sure, but even serious characters don't always speak in perfect complete sentences. Breaking up his dialogue with interruptions or a bit of frustration, maybe a half-finished thought or a sigh, could make it feel more natural. For example, instead of a Surfrush should spend less time chasing the fleeting whims of romance and more time considering who will stand beside them in life, he might say something like, a Surfrush doesn't chase romance, Adrian, they build legacies. It keeps the same meaning but makes it sharper, more conversational from my point of view. Another thing to consider is pacing and interruption. Right now the conversations flow smoothly, but real arguments, especially between family, tend to have more overlap. What if Adrian cut him off mid-sentence? What if Thaddeus hesitated before speaking, like he's searching for the right words? Adding those little beats could create a more dynamic rhythm. Here's a quick example of how that could look. If you spend half as much dedication on finding a proper match. Oh, here we go again. Instead of writing poetry and playing love songs to every passing maiden. See how breaking up gives it a little more bite? It feels more like an actual conversation. If you ask me, the strongest character voice comes from how distinct a character sounds from others, the rhythm of their speech, like long and formal or short and clipped, and how they interact. Do they interrupt, hesitate, ramble, or hold back? In my own writing, I always do a read aloud test. If two characters could swap lines and the dialogue still works, I know I need to tweak it. Every voice should be as unique as the person speaking it. Another way to elevate this scene would be to add more non-verbal cues to show Thaddeus' emotions. Currently his frustration is mostly in his words, but what if we layered in some physicality? Maybe he exhales sharply before speaking, rubs his temple, or glances at Eleonora before answering. Small physical details can add just as much to a scene as spoken words itself. Similarly, instead of worry still lingered in her soft grey eyes, which is a bit too telling for me personally, we could show Eleonora's concern through a subtle action. Maybe her fingers tighten around her handkerchief, or she exchanges a glance with Adrienne before forcing a small nod of reassurance. This could make the emotion feel more natural and immersive. But even when character voice is strong, there's another layer to great dialogue: subtext. So let me now show you the second submission from Agitated Aggregator, which plays with what's said and what's left unsaid. Go on, Max said, holding it out to her with both hands. Her fingers moved before her mind caught up, slipping under the latch and lifting the lid. The breath caught in her throat. Nestled inside, wrapped in soft woven cloth, lay a perfect Lunamist bloom. Its pale blue petals deepened to near black at the center, veins of faint silver threading through the delicate surface. When Samantha shifted the box slightly, the petals seemed to drink in the morning light, casting a faint ethereal glow. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Max," her voice wavered, eyes never leaving the bloom. "Our anniversary isn't for another 2 weeks." "Sometimes," Max said softly, "a woman just deserves flowers." Her smile was immediate, radiant and vulnerable in a way she only ever allowed herself to be around him. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I didn't even know they were blooming this season." The smile Max offered in return was warm, but the flicker of hesitation returned, dimming its edges. "There's something I need to tell you." His hand settled gently on the small of her back. "I wasn't going to bring it up today, but I can't give you these without telling you why." Now this scene does a fantastic job of establishing mood and emotional weight in my opinion. The way Samantha reacts to the Lunamist bloom, the hesitation in Max's words, there's an immediate sense that something deeper is going on here. The moment is intimate, charged with a mix of warmth and unspoken tension. The phrase "the breath caught in her throat" serves as an effective disruption, but it feels somewhat detached from Samantha's perspective. A slight tweak could anchor it more in her experience, in my opinion. Instead of the breath caught in her throat, something like her breath hitched, tight and sudden, would keep the moment immersive while maintaining its impact. But what I really like is how the emotions feel real. Samantha's surprise isn't exaggerated, Max's hesitation is subtle but effective, and the dialogue itself is simple and natural. There's an underlying message that isn't being stated outright. Something is off, but we don't quite know what it is yet. That's where subtext comes into play. Subtext is what's happening beneath the dialogue, the things left unsaid, the emotions hinted at rather than directly stated. But while this scene already does a great job, I would personally tweak a few things to make the tension even stronger. One example is the line, "The smile Max offered in return was warm, but the flicker of hesitation returned, dimming its edges." This leans into telling rather than letting the hesitation naturally emerge. Instead of explicitly stating that hesitation returned, we could show it through his expression or minor actions. For instance, Max smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes, would keep the hesitation subtle yet visible, allowing the reader to infer the emotional undercurrent. Another area I'd look at is Max's last line, "There's something I need to tell you." It works, but it also tells us outright that a reveal is coming. What if instead Max hesitated longer? Maybe he started a sentence only to stop himself, or maybe his body language conveyed his reluctance instead of his words. For example, Max exhaled through his mouth, thumb tracing absent circles against the box. He stopped himself, jaw tightening just slightly. Now, instead of telling the reader that Max is struggling with something, we let them see it. That tiny moment of hesitation makes the reader lean in, curious about what he's holding back. One more opportunity for a refinement, in my opinion, is this line, "radiant and vulnerable in a way she only ever allowed herself to be around him." Currently, again, this is telling us how she feels rather than letting us experience it. Instead, what if we saw her vulnerability through small actions, like her voice catching mid-sentence or her fingers hovering just a moment too long over the pedals before touching them? Giving the reader those physical cues can make her emotions feel even more immersive. And lastly, there's Samantha's reaction overall. She comes across as genuinely surprised, yes, but what if there was just a hint of suspicion or uncertainty? Something subtle, like her fingers tightening around the box or her eyes flicking up to meet Max's just a beat too late. These small details can add layers to the scene without changing a single word or dialogue. That's the magic of subtext. It invites the reader to engage, to pick up on little cues and interpret meaning between the lines. Well, alright, now that we've talked about subtext, let me move on to another kind of dialogue challenge. High conflict conversations. Here's a scene from Willow that's packed with intensity, but does it have the right rhythm to keep that energy engaging? He took a deep breath. The banishment to Caerlinden Isle has no doubts been arduous, but he put me in a difficult position. I know your mother's death was hard for him to cope with. Nevri cut him off. Hard? It ruined him. And instead of trying to help him, you just banished us to that island. His eyes flashed as he leaned forward. I tried to help him. I spent days trying to convince him to bury her in the Gravewood. He couldn't be reasoned with. The Elven Council does not tolerate the use of human magic, especially necromancy. I had no choice. After I banished him, he took your mother's body, and I said nothing. Other families followed him to that island, and I said nothing. He began working with that halfling mage, and I said nothing. I had hoped his banishment would help him realize the error of his ways, but when he arrived here a few months ago, I realized my mistake. he had learned nothing. Planning to attack Irene is not caring about our people. He was going to get us all killed. I'm sorry for the tragedies your families have faced, but my sympathy cannot overlook the danger he has put us in. This scene jumps right into high emotion and high stakes, which is exactly what you want in a tense confrontation. There's no build-up, no small talk, it's straight into the argument, and that makes it instantly engaging. There's a strong sense of urgency in how the dialogue escalates. Neri's anger is immediate, and her interruption makes it clear she's not here for explanations, she's here to fight back. And the response? Just as heated. The other speaker, likely an authority figure, isn't backing down, and his repetition of "I said nothing" gives this scene a weighty rhythm. That said, if I were making small refinements to push the dialogue even further, I'd focus on the following things. Currently, both sides are already at full volume from the start. While that keeps things intense, real arguments often have peaks and valleys, moments of forced calm, hesitation, or shift in power dynamics that make the big emotional spikes hit even harder. One place where a small tweak could make the argument feel more natural is the line, "Neri cut him off." Hard? It ruined him. The phrase "cut him off" is unnecessary since the dialogue itself already conveys the interruption. Instead, dropping directly into her line, "Hard," Neri's voice sharpened, "It ruined him," would make the moment more immediate and forceful without explicitly stating the interruption. Also, what if instead of immediately cutting him off, Neri tries to stay composed at first until she cannot hold back any longer? Something like this. The banishment to Caer Lindon Isle has no doubt been arduous. Neri's fingers curled into fists. Arduous? I know your mother's death was hard for him to cope with, but hard? Neri's voice sharpened. It ruined him. And instead of trying to help him, you just banished us to that island. This small change lets her frustration boil over naturally, rather than starting at full intensity. It makes the outburst feel earned, rather than immediate, from my point of view. Another thing I've noticed is that both speakers have a very formal way of talking, which could make sense for an elven political setting. But if their speech patterns were slightly more distinct, it would add contrast and make the conversation a little bit easier to follow. For example, Neri is driven by emotion, so maybe her lines could be shorter, sharper, and more reactive, while the other speaker stays measured, controlled, until he starts to lose that control. Take this part. After I banished him, he took your mother's body, and I said nothing. Other families followed him to that island, and I said nothing. He began working with that halfling mage, and I said nothing. I had hoped his banishment would help him realize the error of his ways, but when he arrived here a few months ago, I realized my mistake. He had learned nothing. Right now, the dialogue has a strong sense of rhythm, but it is also quite an uninterrupted monologue that could lean more into showing the character's internal shifts for me personally. What if, for example, he starts calm, but frustration slowly creeps in, making his words shorter or more clipped, until he's barely holding back his anger or frustration. Like this, for example. I let him take your mother's body. I let the others follow. Even let him work with that halfling mage. I said nothing, again and again, and for what? This way, key details remain present, but it also reflects his growing frustration rather than just stating it. Another simple yet effective adjustment would be replacing the dash in "planning to attack Irene is not caring about our people. He was going to get us all killed." Using an M dash here gives a sharper break, making the contrast between caring and "he was going to get us all killed" land with more impact. Planning to attack Irene is not caring about our people. He was going to get us all killed. This small change heightens the weight of the statement, reinforcing the speaker's frustration. And the last thing I've noticed is that the majority of this scene is carried by spoken words. Body language, gestures, and silence can often say just as much though. For example, instead of "his eyes flashed as he leaned forward," what if we went with something more unique? His fingers tapped once against the desk. Just once. Then he leaned forward, his voice lower now. That tells us he's about to drop something important, without him needing to say it outright. In my own writing, I always try to layer conflict rather than just having two people shout their viewpoints. Arguments aren't just about what's said, they're about who has the power at any given moment. The strongest dialogue has contrast with big emotions next to quiet tension, and outbursts next to hesitation. And sometimes the most powerful moment in an argument isn't a shout at all, it's when someone simply stops talking. Now, if you want your own work reviewed this way as well, then consider joining the Tale Tinkerers Guild to improve your writing alongside a community of like-minded fantasy writers. You can find the link in the description below. Moving on, dialogue isn't just about making an impact in heated moments. It also needs to feel natural and quieter, more reflective scenes. So let me show you a different approach from Pete next. The weathered face of Guildmaster Einar appeared in Olera's memory, a silver eyebrow raised. You sure about this? Deep and gravelly, his voice carried the weight of experience. His rose tattoo, faded with age, mirrored hers. The society keeps its hands clean. Sovereignty, foundry, it don't matter. Stay neutral, that's all. He paused, the corner of his mouth dropping. This plan, his expression hardened. You know the rules, Thorn. If you break them. He left the sentence unfinished. Nodding, Olera accepted the consequences. Her shoulders tightened, a barely visible flinch at the prospect of the price, expulsion from the guild, the mark of a rogue. Her own kind might hunt her down, should the price tempt them enough. Olera swallowed. It's personal, I know. Her hand tightened almost invisibly on the rose hilt of a dagger. Cox to the contract. Some things outranked the scrapping code. Corvin's my brother. Beneath rasping, Einar remained silent. He raised his tankard, gaslight shining off the silver rim. Then, at least, he said, don't die for nothing. This scene has a great tone. It feels weighty, deliberate, like every word is chosen carefully. There's history between these characters, and you can feel the tension in the pauses. But at the same time, there's something about it that feels a little too scripted for me. Like it was written to sound cool rather than to feel like a natural conversation. Let me break down what I mean. The atmosphere and the tone are strong. There's weight to the scene that makes it engaging. Guildmaster Einar doesn't need to say much to establish his authority. The sense of unspoken rules and history between him and Olera adds layers without an exposition dump. Also, the character voices are distinct. Einar has a short, clipped way of speaking. He's a man who's seen too much, who doesn't waste words. Olera, by contrast, is controlled but emotional, just keeping herself together. Their voices don't blend, which makes the conversation easy to follow. The scene is also visually and physically grounded. The small details, his rose tattoo, the gaslight glinting off his tankard, the way Olera grips her dagger, help make the world feel real without stopping the flow of the conversation. Now, if I were tweaking this scene though, here's what I'd focused on. First, making it feel more like a real conversation. As is, this reads more like a movie trailer to me. Every line is almost perfectly timed, the pauses are dramatic, and every sentence lands like a quote rather than natural speech. For example, Cox to the contract. Some things outrank the scrapping code. Corvin's my brother. That does sound cool, but do people actually talk like that? What if instead she hesitated, let her emotions slip through just a little? Here's an alternative version. Cox to the contract, she exhaled, jaw tight. But this is different. This is Torvin. Now instead of a scripted moment, it feels like she's thinking through what she's saying. It's less polished, which makes it feel more real if you ask me. Secondly, I'd look at the flow by adjusting the transition between his voice, the tattoo, and his words. Right now, the shift from his gravelly voice to the visual of the rose tattoo feels slightly disconnected. Instead of completely splitting these ideas, what if we linked the tattoo to his movement or expression? Something like, his rose tattoo, faded with age, shifted as he flexed his fingers. The society keeps its hands clean. This keeps the focus on his presence and authority while leading smoothly into his dialogue without an abrupt pause in pacing. And next, one small wording adjustment that could improve readability is in the phrase, her hand tightened almost invisibly on the rose hilt of a dagger. Almost invisibly feels awkward because it's unclear whether it's meant to be unnoticed or just subtle. A clearer way to phrase this could be, her grip on the rose hilt remained loose, almost. A flicker of tension, gone as soon as it came. This suggests the action is barely noticeable without explicitly stating it. And lastly, I would consider to lighten some of the formality. One of the most common traps in fantasy dialogue is making everyone sound like they're giving a monologue. Even hardened mentors should have some casual rough edges to their speech, in my opinion. In the original version, Einar says, then, at least, he said, don't die for nothing. I'd consider making this sound more like a real, wary warning than a scripted send-off. For example, then at least, Einar exhaled, shaking his head, just don't be stupid, Thorn. Still punchy, still weighty, but a little bit more natural. When I'm writing dialogue like this, I personally always ask myself, does it sound too perfect? If so, I rough it up a little. Does every sentence feel like a quote? In that case, I break up the rhythm. And would a person actually say this in the heat of the moment? If they wouldn't, I have to tweak it. Now, finding the right balance and tone can be tricky though, especially when humor is involved. But let me show you how humor interacts with fantasy dialogue in our next submission from Terry. How the hell does one start a goddamn fire around here? Never meet human dumb as you, he said in a weary voice. I'm not dumb. You might be right, but you like to think otherwise. And I'm still asking the question. Ask dumb questions. Just pretend I was born yesterday. He stared at her, dumbfounded. Even young ones know how to start fire. Can't be born yesterday. Too big. I've led a sheltered life. He blinked. Okay, say I lost my memory. I forgot everything I ever knew. Pretend I have amnesia. Another blink. He sighed. Look, I know I sound stupid, but I'm really not. I come from somewhere else, far away, and I've never needed to start a fire like this, out in the middle of nowhere. I'm lost and have no idea where I'm going or why I'm even here. He blinked again, then said, Fire stick. Fire stick? Her voice rose. A fire stick. He pulled a small pouch from one of his panty pockets and shook out a thin wooden stick. Her eyes widened. A match! You use a match! What is match? Amanda laughed, or maybe it was crying. A fire stick. This scene is fun, and humor and fantasy is something I love to see. A well-placed comedic moment can make a story feel more alive, breaking up tension and making characters more relatable. The banter here works well because it's quick, plays off cultural differences, and builds on misunderstandings. Classic comedic structure. The slow blinking reaction from the likely non-human character adds great timing, and Amanda's frustration is very relatable. That said, if I were making some refinements, one of the first things that stood out to me was the modern phrasing in Amanda's lines, like, how the hell does one start a goddamn fire around here? And I've led a sheltered life. Whether this works depends entirely on the story's setting and subgenre. For example, in a portal fantasy where Amanda is from a modern world, this dialogue could feel completely natural, emphasizing the contrast between her background and the setting she's now in. However, in a more immersive traditional fantasy world, such phrasing might feel out of place. This is why it's always important to consider how the dialogue aligns with the world's tone. If the goal would be to ensure a smooth integration into the fantasy setting, some minor wording adjustments could help here. For instance, instead of how the hell does one start a goddamn fire around here, an alternative could be, how in all the realms do people start fires in this forsaken place? This keeps the frustration intact while making it feel a bit more at home in a fantasy world. And instead of, I've led a sheltered life, we could say, where I come from, I never needed to do this. This keeps the meaning while feeling more adaptable across different fantasy subgenres. The key takeaway here isn't that modern phrasing is wrong, it's that it should be a deliberate choice based on the world and the story being built. Next then, I would be looking at clarifying and strengthening character voice. There are a couple of places where small refinements can make the character voices clearer and more distinct in my opinion. This line, for example, is a bit ambiguous in intent. Ask dumb questions. Is he urging her to keep asking dumb questions, or stating that she already is? A slight rewording could clarify this more, something like, you asking dumb questions. This still keeps his speech pattern intact, but removes the potential confusion. We also have the following phrase. Never meet human dumb as you, he said in a very voice. To avoid he said and make it more visually engaging, we could tweak it to, he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Never meet human dumb as you. This keeps the wariness intact, but now it's shown through his action rather than a dialogue tag. Another point I'd be looking at here is enhancing Amanda's frustration through action. Her frustration builds gradually, but there's one moment where we could make it even more vivid by breaking up her dialogue with some form of physical reaction. The current version reads, she sighed. Look, I know I sound stupid, but I'm really not. I come from somewhere else, far away, and I've never needed to start a fire like this out in the middle of nowhere. I'm lost and have no idea where I'm going or why I'm even here. An improved version from my point of view would add even more action for emphasis, such as, she sighed, raking a hand through her hair. I know I sound stupid, but I'm really not. She paced a step away, then back again. I come from somewhere else, far away, and I've never needed to start a fire like this, out in the middle of nowhere. Her voice grew tighter. I'm lost. I have no idea where I'm going or why I'm even here. Now her frustration feels more physical, which makes the moment land with more emotional weight. Lastly, when it comes to refinements, I try to sharpen the joke payoff at the end. The fire stick moment works well, but I'd argue that we can fine-tune the timing to make it land even stronger. Currently it reads, he blinked again, then said, fire stick. Fire stick, her voice rose? A fire stick. An alternative version for comedic rhythm could be this. He nodded, fire stick. Fire stick, her voice shut up. He blinked again, once, twice. Then with all the patience in the world, yes, fire stick. This slight adjustment gets rid of the he said tags, and it adds just a beat of hesitation, which can make the joke land harder by making it feel like he's finally throwing her a bone. And having said that, it's time to move on to the final submission from Tissa, where I want to bring up another tricky balance. How to create mystery without making dialogue feel vague or evasive. You're wearing it, he said, his tone unreadable. Rin nodded, her throat dry. Yeah, I put it on after school. Draven stepped into the kitchen, his movements deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze never leaving her face. Why? The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain what happened when she didn't even understand it herself? I don't know, she said finally, her voice trembling. Something weird happened again today. This time it was really freaky. Draven's expressions didn't change, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt? Weird how? Rin hesitated, her mind racing. Should she tell him? He'd always been so secretive, so guarded. Would he even believe her? The lights, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. They kept flickering, and the shadows, they looked wrong, like they were moving. Draven's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. And there were whispers, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't understand them, but they were there. And then it stopped, when I put on the bracelet. This is the kind of scene that relies heavily on mystery. It's not about delivering information, it's about raising questions, making the reader lean in and keeping them hooked. And in that sense, it does a great job. There's hesitation, unspoken tension, and unease in the way Rin speaks and the way Draven reacts, or more importantly, doesn't react. The reader knows something is off, but we're not being spoon-fed answers, which is exactly what you want in a mystery-driven moment. That being said, if I were making adjustments here, I'd focus on clarity, making sure the mystery draws the reader in rather than pushing them away. As it stands, Draven's silence is intriguing, but it happens a little too often in my opinion. He barely responds at all, which makes it feel like the conversation is one-sided. Instead of just tightening his jaw or offering unreadable expressions, what if he had a reaction that hinted at something deeper? For example here, Draven's jaws tightened, but he didn't say anything. What if instead it would read, Draven's jaw tightened, and for a second his fingers twitched, like he wanted to reach for the bracelet, but thought better of it. This keeps the mystery intact, but makes it feel like he's holding something back. It gives readers something to latch onto without outright explaining anything. We also have Rin struggling to explain what happened, but some of her dialogue could be trimmed slightly to make her uncertainty feel more natural. For example, we have this part here. I don't know, she said finally, her voice trembling. Something weird happened again today. This time it was really freaky. The phrase, this time it was really freaky, feels redundant to me. She already said, something weird happened again today. An alternative to this part could be, I don't know, she said finally, her voice trembling. Something happened again today. Worse than before. This keeps the uncertainty and the mystery while making her words feel more deliberate. One area where the transition could feel smoother is when Rin shifts from hesitation to speaking. Instead of, should she tell him? He'd always been so secretive, so guarded. Would he even believe her? The lights, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. They kept flickering, and the shadows, they looked wrong, like they were moving. I'd revise it slightly while keeping the natural pauses. Like this, for example. Could she tell him? He'd always been so secretive, so guarded. Would he even believe her? The lights, she chose her words carefully. They kept flickering, and the shadows, they looked wrong, like they were moving. This keeps her uncertainty intact, removes the dialogue tag sad, and makes the moment feel a little bit more organic if you ask me. Another small refinement is in the sentence, and there were whispers, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The repetition of whisper in such close proximity makes the line feel unintentionally redundant rather than stylistically deliberate. A simple tweak could smooth this out while keeping the eerie effect intact. One approach is to tie the two together. And there were whispers, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper as well. This makes the repetition feel intentional, linking the two rather than making them sound accidentally redundant. Alternatively, we could swap one instance for variety while preserving the hushed, unsettling tone. And there were whispers, she continued, her voice barely above a murmur. This small change removes the unintended repetition while maintaining the quiet tension in the scene. Now, whether by connecting the whispers or varying the wording, the goal would be to refine the sentence so it enhances the mystery without pulling the reader out of the moment. Small adjustments like these may seem minor, but they can make the difference between dialogue that subtly immerses the reader and dialogue that unintentionally disrupts the scene's effect. And that's really the heart of great fantasy dialogue. It's not just about making lines sound cool, it's about making them feel real, immersive, and emotionally resonant. A lighthearted joke, a tense argument, or a quiet moment filled with unspoken meaning, every line should serve the story. But crafting great dialogue is just one piece of the puzzle though. If you want to take your entire writing process to the next level and actually finish your fantasy novel without getting stuck, watch this video here next where I break down the exact framework that saved me months of rewriting and helped me craft my own stories with confidence.